Emma moved through the small cafe with quiet steps, carrying a tray of coffee cups and pastries. The smell of roasted beans and freshly baked bread filled the air, wrapping the place in warmth. People came and went, laughing, chatting, clinking glasses. No one really noticed her, and Emma preferred it that way. She smiled softly when someone thanked her, nodded politely when someone asked for more sugar, and went back to her work. To the customers, she was just another waitress. But behind that calm face was a world full of memories and dreams she had long locked away. Every morning, Emma arrived before sunrise. She would tie her brown hair into a neat bun, put on her white blouse, and tie the cafe apron around her waist. The uniform was simple, but to her, it was more than just fabric. It was a reminder of the life she had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen her. The cafe wasn't just her workplace, it was her second home. She knew every table, every chair, every regular customer. She even knew which corner the sunlight would touch first as morning light filtered through the windows. Emma didn't talk much, but she listened. She noticed the couple who always argued, the old man who read the same newspaper every day, and the group of young professionals who laughed too loudly after work. She saw them all, but none of them really saw her. They didn't know that behind her gentle smile lived a woman who had once dreamed of standing on grand stages, playing music that could touch people's hearts. Years ago, when she was a teenager, Emma's world was filled with melodies. Her mother, who worked hard to support her, saved money to buy her an old, upright piano. Emma would sit by it for hours, practicing scales and songs, filling their small apartment with sound. The piano wasn't perfect, one of the keys stuck and the pedals creaked, but to her, it was magic. Every note she played was like a whisper of hope. Her dream was simple, to become a pianist, to share her music with the world, to make her mother proud. But dreams are fragile things. When her mother fell ill, everything changed. Hospital bills piled up, and Emma's music lessons became a luxury she could no longer afford. She sold the piano to pay for medicine. The day it was taken away, she stood by the window, watching as her dream rolled down the street in the back of a truck. That night, the apartment was silent, painfully silent. And in that silence, Emma made a decision. She would find work, any work, to keep them going. Years passed. Her mother's illness worsened, and when she finally passed away, Emma felt as if the last bit of music in her life had gone with her. She moved to the city, found a job at the cafe, and promised herself that she would never dream too big again. It hurt less that way. Life was easier when you didn't expect much from it. So, she poured her heart into her work, wiping tables, serving customers, and memorizing every menu item. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Still, sometimes, when the cafe grew quiet between the morning and evening rush, Emma would find herself glancing at the piano in the corner. It was old, with chipped wood and yellowed keys, but it reminded her of the one she used to play. Occasionally, musicians came in to perform during busy nights, filling the room with laughter and applause. Emma would pause for a second behind the counter, her hands resting on a coffee pot, her eyes distant as she listened. The sound awakened something inside her, something she had buried deep beneath years of silence. But she always turned away before the song ended, reminding herself that music belonged to another life, not hers anymore. Her co-workers liked her but never knew much about her. Emma's nice, they'd say, but quiet. She avoided gossip, smiled when spoken to, and never joined in the jokes. It wasn't that she didn't like people, she just didn't know where she fit anymore. In a world that moved fast, she felt like a forgotten note in a song everyone else had moved past. Yet there was kindness in her silence. When a customer spilled coffee, she was the first to clean it up. When a child cried, she offered them a napkin folded into a little heart. Her gentleness wasn't loud, but it was real. It showed in the way she treated everyone, with patience, even when they didn't deserve it. Still, every now and then, she would look at her reflection in the cafe window and wonder who she had become. Was she just a waitress? Was this all there was to her story? A part of her wanted to believe that life still had surprises waiting, that maybe, just maybe, music wasn't completely gone from her world. But the thought always faded as quickly as it came. buried under the weight of empty coffee cups and long shifts. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and golden light spilled into the cafe, Emma wiped down the counter and smiled faintly. Another day done. Another quiet victory. She didn't know that in just a few hours, her ordinary life would turn into something extraordinary. That the same piano she'd been avoiding for years would soon bring her back to the person she once was. For now, she was just the waitress. Quiet, unnoticed, and carrying a dream that still beat softly beneath her calm, tired heart. That Friday evening, the cafe buzzed with life. The golden lights hanging from the ceiling shimmered over polished wooden tables, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked, and the comforting scent of roasted coffee and caramel desserts spread like a soft blanket. It was one of those nights when the world outside seemed distant, and everyone wanted to stay just a little longer. Emma moved quickly between the tables, balancing trays of coffee cups and slices of cheesecake, her white apron fluttering as she passed. Her hair had come loose from the bun she tied every morning, a few strands brushing against her face. She tucked them behind her ear and forced a small smile whenever a customer called her over. The cafe was packed, louder than usual, a sure sign that the weekend had begun. At the far end of the room, a small upright piano stood quietly against the wall. It was old and a little out of tune, but people loved it. Every Friday, a local musician would come to play soft jazz and blues, giving the place a soul that words couldn't. Tonight, everyone was expecting the same: music, laughter, and a perfect start to the weekend. But not everything was going as planned. Behind the counter, the manager looked pale and nervous, holding his phone to his ear. "You're kidding me," he muttered, his voice tense. Emma passed by, catching bits of the conversation. "The pianist just canceled," he said finally, running his hand through his hair. "Food poisoning. Great. Just great." Emma pretended not to hear, but her heart gave a small tug. She glanced at the piano, sitting there silently like an old friend waiting to be remembered. The thought of playing again flashed in her mind, but she quickly pushed it away. It had been years since her fingers touched a keyboard. She was a waitress now, not a musician. The manager sighed and stepped out of the kitchen, his expression tired. "All right, everyone," he announced to the staff. "No live music tonight, just background tracks." He tried to sound calm, but the disappointment was clear in his tone. A few customers nearby overheard and groaned. "Ah, that's a shame," one man said loudly. "That piano's been the best part of this place." "Yeah," another added, smirking. "Maybe the waitress can fill in. She looks like she's got time." Laughter followed. Sharp, careless laughter that made Emma's cheeks warm. She didn't turn around. She kept wiping the table, pretending their words didn't sting. But she heard every one of them. The group of men at the bar continued joking. They were regulars, office workers who came every week after hours. They liked to tease the staff, especially Emma, because she was quiet and never fought back. "Come on," one of them said. "Bet she can play chopsticks at least." The others laughed again, clinking their glasses together. Emma took a deep breath and straightened up. She'd learned long ago that silence was easier than reaction. Still, something about their laughter made her heart ache. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the way it reminded her of everything she'd given up. As the evening grew busier, the cafe filled with more chatter. The music from the speakers didn't help. It felt hollow, like a poor imitation of what was supposed to be. Even the customers noticed. "It's not the same without the live piano," one woman whispered to her friend. Emma's eyes drifted once again toward the piano. The dim light above it cast soft shadows on the wooden floor. She could almost imagine the sound of it. The smooth keys under her fingers, the melody flowing through the room like a story being told. She looked away quickly, scolding herself. "Stop it, Emma. That part of your life is gone." The manager rubbed his temples. "This night's a disaster," he muttered. "We've got a full house and no music." Emma hesitated before speaking. Her voice was soft, almost unsure. I can play a little, she said. The manager blinked. You can play? She nodded slowly. A bit. I used to. When I was younger. Before he could respond, one of the men at the bar overheard and burst out laughing. Oh, here we go. The waitress is gonna save the night, he said, mock applause following his words. His friends joined in, grinning. Emma's stomach twisted, but she didn't back away. The manager frowned at them and turned to her. You sure? She nodded again, more firmly this time. Yes. The cafe felt quieter as she walked toward the piano. The laughter faded, replaced by curious murmurs. Some people leaned forward in their seats, whispering. Others rolled their eyes, expecting a joke. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she reached the bench. She brushed off the dust from the keys and sat down, her apron still tied around her waist. Her heart pounded. For a moment she just stared at the piano. The chipped paint, the faint smell of wood polish, the yellowed keys. Her reflection shone faintly on the glossy surface. Can I still do this? She wondered. Behind her someone coughed. A few giggles spread across the room, but Emma closed her eyes and took a slow breath. The noise faded. She let her fingers hover above the keys, just as she used to when she was a girl, back in that tiny apartment where dreams still felt possible. When she pressed the first note, it came out soft and uncertain. Then another followed, and another. A melody began to take shape. Gentle at first, like a whisper, then stronger, fuller. The sound filled the room, wrapping around every table, every corner, like warm sunlight after a storm. People stopped talking. The laughter died. Even the men at the bar turned in their seats, watching in silence. Emma's fingers moved with growing confidence, finding rhythm, emotion, memory. The music wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it carried a piece of her heart in every note. The cafe that had been noisy and restless just minutes ago now felt like a different world. No one saw a waitress anymore. They saw an artist, someone who had lived, lost, and found herself again through sound. And though Emma didn't look up, she could feel it. The change in the air, the stillness, the awe. The same people who laughed at her were now listening with open mouths and quiet hearts. And for the first time in years, Emma wasn't just serving tables. She was serving her soul. The cafe was completely still. The sound of Emma's fingers gliding across the keys filled every corner of the room. What had started as a soft, trembling tune was now flowing like water, smooth, steady, alive. Her hands moved with grace, her eyes half closed, lost in the world that only she could see. For the first time in years, she wasn't a waitress. She was a musician again. But before that moment, just minutes earlier, people had laughed. The sound of their mocking voices still echoed faintly in the air. A few of the regulars who had made fun of her earlier sat frozen, their smiles fading as the music took over. They had expected a clumsy, awkward attempt, something to laugh at. Instead, what they heard felt like magic. Emma didn't play a popular song. She didn't need to. The melody she created came straight from her heart, raw and full of emotion. It was a mix of sadness and hope, like a story without words. The notes rose and fell gently, as if they carried the weight of her past. The struggles, the heartbreak, the memories of a dream she once thought was lost forever. Every sound from the piano told a story. When her fingers danced lightly across the higher keys, it felt like sunlight filtering through clouds. When she pressed the lower ones, there was depth, a quiet ache that made the listeners feel something they couldn't name. The cafe, once buzzing with chatter, had transformed into a silent audience. Even the coffee machine's steady hum seemed to fade away. At a nearby table, an elderly man set down his drink, his eyes glistening. He didn't know who this waitress was, but the music reminded him of something long ago. His first love, perhaps, or a memory of a time when life felt simpler. Across the room, a young woman held her breath, her chest tightening as the melody stirred emotions she hadn't felt in years. Emma's co-workers stood near the counter, watching in disbelief. The manager, who had been panicking about the ruined evening, now stood perfectly still. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide. The same waitress who spent her days quietly serving coffee was now commanding the entire room without saying a single word. Even the men at the bar, the ones who had laughed the loudest, couldn't find their voices anymore. One of them lowered his glass slowly, his face softening. Another looked down, uncomfortable. The laughter that once echoed through the cafe now felt cruel, out of place, almost shameful. Emma, however, wasn't thinking about them. She wasn't thinking about anyone. For her, the piano had erased the crowd, the tables, the noise, everything. All that existed was her and the sound. She remembered her mother's face, the way she used to sit nearby when Emma practiced as a girl. She could almost hear her voice, gentle and proud, saying, "Keep going, sweetheart. You're meant for this." Her heart ached, but not in the same way it used to. This time, it was an ache that brought peace. The kind that comes when you finally find what you've been missing. The light above the piano glowed softly on her face, highlighting the tears she hadn't realized were slipping down her cheeks. But she didn't stop playing. The melody became stronger, braver, as if each note was burning away the years of fear and silence she had carried. The cafe's customers leaned forward, completely still. Time seemed to slow down. The clinking of spoons, the murmurs of conversation, the tapping of phones, all gone. It was just Emma and her piano, telling a story that words could never express. She shifted the tone, from melancholy to hope, from memory to rebirth. Her fingers fluttered across the keys, weaving light and shadow together. The sound was not polished, not perfect, but it was real. That was what made it so powerful. Every imperfection made it human, and every pause carried meaning. When the song finally reached its highest point, Emma's posture straightened. Her hands lifted slightly, then pressed down with strength and emotion, releasing a wave of music that seemed to fill even the smallest corners of the cafe. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the music softened. The final notes drifted through the air, tender and fragile. They lingered, a few seconds of silence that felt eternal. Then the sound faded completely. For a long moment, no one moved. The air was thick with emotion. People looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Then, someone started to clap, slowly at first, like they were afraid to break the spell. But the applause grew louder, stronger, until the whole cafe was on its feet. Emma opened her eyes, blinking in surprise. She looked around, dazed, as if waking from a dream. Faces that once held laughter now glowed with admiration. Some people were wiping away tears. The men who had mocked her earlier clapped the hardest, their expressions full of guilt and respect. Emma's cheeks flushed as she gave a shy smile. She wasn't used to being seen like this. For years she had been invisible, a background figure in other people's stories. But tonight, she had become the story. As the applause continued, Emma bowed her head slightly, her hands still trembling from the performance. The manager came forward, still amazed, and whispered, "Emma, that was beautiful." She smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said softly. In that moment, something inside her shifted. Something small, but powerful. The laughter that once cut through her confidence had turned into applause. The same piano that had gathered dust in the corner had become her voice again. And as she stood there, surrounded by people who had finally seen her for who she truly was, Emma realized something simple but life-changing. Her dream hadn't died. It had just been waiting for her to find it again. Emma sat frozen at the piano, her heart still racing from what she had just done. The cafe had erupted in applause a few minutes earlier, and though the noise had faded, the energy still hung thick in the air, like the final shimmer of a note that refused to die away. She had no idea what had come over her. It was as if something deep inside her, something she'd buried years ago, had suddenly decided it was time to breathe again. The manager was still standing by the counter, staring at her like she'd just performed a miracle. He rubbed the back of his neck, completely speechless. That was... wow, he finally said, his voice breaking the silence. Emma, I had no idea you could play like that. Emma smiled faintly, her cheeks flushed. I didn't either, she said quietly, almost to herself. Her hands rested on her lap, still trembling from the rush of it all. For a moment, the cafe didn't feel like a workplace anymore. It felt like home. The customers had returned to their conversations, but the mood was different now. Softer, lighter. The same people who had once dismissed her now looked at her with a mix of admiration and guilt. One of the men at the bar raised his glass slightly, a silent gesture of apology. Emma caught his eye and nodded politely before turning back to the piano. The manager stepped closer. You saved the night, he said sincerely. Everyone was about to leave, and then, well, you changed everything. Emma laughed quietly. I just didn't want the piano to sit there in silence, she said. But inside, she knew it was more than that. Something had pulled her toward it. Something that felt like destiny. Or maybe just courage finally breaking free after too long. Play another one, someone called out from a corner table. Others agreed, clapping lightly, urging her on. Emma hesitated. Her first song had come from instinct, pure emotion. But now, with everyone watching, she felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders again. Could she do it twice? She looked down at her hands. The faint glow from the overhead light reflected off the keys. She took a deep breath, smiled nervously, and began again. This time, a slower tune, something tender and full of heart. The notes floated softly, like a lullaby for forgotten dreams. The room quieted once more. Even the street outside, and he seemed to pause, the usual hum of cars fading into the background. Emma's music carried the kind of warmth that made people forget where they were. Couples leaned closer together, friends fell silent mid-sentence, and even the kitchen staff peeked out from behind the doorway just to listen. For Emma, every note was a memory. She remembered the small apartment where she first learned to play, the sound of her mother humming softly as she cooked dinner, the creak of the old floor under the piano bench. She remembered the nights she practiced until her fingers ached, and how her mother would smile proudly, saying, "One day, the world will hear you, Emma." Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't stop playing. Her heart was guiding her fingers now, and for the first time in years, she wasn't running from her pain. She was transforming it into beauty. When the final note faded, there was another moment of silence, the kind that feels sacred. Then came the applause again, louder this time, full of joy and emotion. Some people stood, cheering. A few even wiped their eyes. Emma turned on the bench and smiled shyly at them, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The manager clapped his hands together and grinned. "That's it," he said. "From now on, we're not having any more guest musicians. We already have one." The cafe burst into laughter and cheers, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was warm, genuine, full of admiration. The same people who had doubted her now treated her like a star. One of the men from the bar, the loudest one from earlier, stood up awkwardly and walked toward her. "Hey," he said softly, scratching his head. "About earlier, I was out of line. You're incredible. Seriously." Emma looked at him for a second, then smiled. "Thank you," she said simply. There was no anger left in her, only peace. As the night went on, people kept coming up to her, thanking her for the music, asking if she had performed anywhere else. She laughed and told them no, that she hadn't played in years, but deep down, she knew this was the beginning of something. When the cafe finally began to close and the last customer left, Emma stayed behind, wiping tables and humming softly. The piano sat in the corner, quiet again, but it didn't look lonely anymore. It looked alive. The manager came over with 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "You were amazing tonight," he said, handing her one. "I think you reminded everyone, including yourself, that you're meant for more than just waiting tables." Emma smiled at him, her eyes glistening. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I'm happy I started here." They sat in silence for a while, sipping their drinks. The cafe lights dimmed, and outside the city sparkled with the glow of street lamps and distant headlights. Emma turned her gaze back to the piano, her reflection faintly visible on its glossy surface. She traced her fingers along the edge of the keys one last time before heading out. As she stepped into it all, the cool night air, the sounds of the city surrounded her, laughter, footsteps, the rhythm of life. But beneath it all, she could still hear the echo of her music, faint but steady, like a heartbeat. For years, she had believed her story was ordinary, that her chance had passed. But tonight proved her wrong. The laughter that once stung had become applause. The silence she once feared had turned into melody. And as she walked down the quiet street, a small smile on her lips, Emma realized that sometimes it only takes one brave moment to turn an ordinary life into something extraordinary. Emma returned to work the next morning, still feeling the echo of last night's magic in her chest. The cafe looked the same as always. Warm lights, the smell of fresh coffee, soft chatter. Yet somehow, everything felt different. It wasn't the place that had changed. It was her. For the first time in years, she felt awake. When she walked in, her coworkers greeted her with wide smiles. "There she is, the star of the night," one of them said, clapping playfully. Emma blushed and shook her head. "Oh, stop," she murmured, but she couldn't help smiling. It was strange being noticed, not for how quickly she refilled coffee cups, but for something that came from her heart. The manager appeared from the back, waving a small newspaper. "Emma, you made it in the paper," he said, grinning. She froze, her eyes widening. He pointed at a short article in the local section. "Waitress stuns crowd with unexpected piano performance." There was even a photo, blurry, but it was clearly her, sitting at the piano with her eyes closed, lost in the music. She covered her mouth in surprise. "Oh my God. I didn't even know someone was recording." "Everyone was," the manager said with a laugh. "Your video's all over social media. You're a hit." Emma blinked, her heart pounding. The thought of so many strangers watching her play was both thrilling and terrifying. "You're kidding." He shook his head. "Nope. People are coming in just to ask about you." And he was right. All day, new customers arrived, curious faces who'd seen her video online. Some just wanted to hear her story. Others hoped she'd play again. Emma served them as usual, polite and warm, but her mind was racing. That night, as the cafe grew quieter, someone from the crowd asked softly, "Will you play again?" She hesitated, glancing at the piano. Part of her wanted to say no, to keep that one perfect memory untouched. But another part of her, the one that had been buried for too long, whispered yes. So she sat down, just as she had before, and began to play. This time, there was no fear. The notes flowed freely, rich with joy. She felt lighter, as if each melody was freeing her from the weight she'd carried for years. People listened quietly, smiling, recording, and clapping softly when she finished. It was no longer about proving herself. It was about sharing something beautiful. After closing, Emma lingered by the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys. It felt like touching an old friend, one who had never really left her. She smiled, whispering, "I missed you." The days turned into weeks, and the story of the waitress who played the piano continued to spread. Local radio hosts mentioned her, and one morning a music teacher stopped by to meet her in person. "You have a gift," he told her. "If you ever want to perform, I can help you prepare." Emma was stunned. "Perform? I'm not a professional." The man smiled kindly. "Maybe not yet, but you are a musician. You just forgot for a while. Those words stayed with her. That night when she went home, she couldn't stop thinking about her mother. She pulled out an old box from under her bed, filled with sheet music, old notebooks, and a few faded photos. One of them showed her as a little girl, sitting beside her mother at the piano, both smiling. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't from sadness. It was from gratitude. The next weekend, the cafe was busier than ever. People came from nearby towns just to see the Waitress pianist. Emma played twice that night. Soft jazz first, then a piece she'd written herself when she was 16. As she played, she felt completely free. The laughter, the doubts, the years of silence, all of it faded into nothing. The only thing that mattered was the music. When the last song ended, a little girl walked up to her shyly. "I want to play like you someday," she said. Emma knelt down, smiling warmly. "You will," she whispered. "Just never stop believing in your dream, okay?" The girl nodded, eyes shining. Watching her walk back to her parents, Emma felt something beautiful. The same spark that had once pushed her to play as a child. And now, she was passing it on. Later that night, when the cafe emptied out, Emma sat alone at the piano, her reflection faint in its polished wood. She didn't feel like a waitress anymore. She didn't feel like someone who had been forgotten. She felt like herself, the girl who once dreamed big, and the woman who had finally found the courage to dream again. As she played one last gentle melody, the notes drifted out into the night air through the open window. Somewhere outside, a passerby stopped and smiled at the sound. Emma didn't see them, but that didn't matter. Her music had found its way back into the world, and this time, it wasn't going anywhere. For years, she had lived quietly, hiding behind the noise of other people's lives, but now the music inside her was louder than ever, and as she played, her heart whispered the truth she'd always known but forgotten. Sometimes, life doesn't laugh at you because you're small. It laughs to see if you'll rise. And when you do, it falls silent in awe. Halfway through the performance, she glanced toward the audience and saw familiar faces. Her cafe co-workers, her manager, even the same group of customers who once laughed at her. They were smiling proudly now, eyes glistening. By the time the final note faded, the silence was so deep it felt sacred. Then, the applause began. Hesitant at first, then stronger, then roaring. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting her name. Emma bowed her head, tears welling in her eyes. She had dreamed of a moment like this as a little girl, and now it was real. After the show, David came backstage, beaming. "I knew it," he said. "You belong out there, Emma." She laughed through her tears. "I almost didn't believe it myself." "Believe it," he said softly, "because everyone else already does." That night, as she walked home under the stars, the city felt different, brighter, kinder. She looked up at the sky, remembering her mother's words from long ago. "The world will hear you one day." And now, it had. Emma smiled, feeling a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a waitress anymore, and she wasn't just a pianist. She was both. A woman who had fallen, struggled, and risen again through music. The laughter that once broke her spirit had become applause that lifted her higher than she ever dreamed possible. And as she turned the corner toward home, the faint rhythm of her steps matched the melody still playing softly in her mind. The song that had changed everything. The weeks after Emma's theater performance felt like something out of a dream. Every morning, she still tied her apron and served coffee at the cafe. But now, people came in not just for food. They came to see her. Customers asked, "Are you the pianist from the paper?" and smiled as if meeting someone famous. Emma always blushed and said softly, "Yes, that's me." The cafe owner had even placed a small sign near the piano that read, "Our very own Emma, the heart behind the music." Every time she saw it, her heart fluttered. She never wanted fame or attention. She just wanted to feel alive again. But now, she was living a dream she had once buried. And the most beautiful part? She hadn't changed who she was to get there. She was still the same gentle, quiet Emma, just finally seen for who she truly was. One Thursday evening, after a long shift, Emma stayed behind again. The cafe was empty, the lights dimmed, and the world outside was quiet. She sat at the piano, pressing one key softly, listening to its lonely echo. The night air drifted through the half-open window, carrying the faint sounds of the city. Cars, laughter, distant music. She smiled to herself. As her fingers moved gently over the keys, a familiar sadness mixed with peace in her heart. The music she played wasn't for an audience tonight. It was for her mother. For the little girl she used to be, for the woman she had become. Each note felt like a memory, bittersweet but healing. Halfway through her song, she heard a voice behind her. "You never stop amazing me." She turned to see her manager leaning against the doorway, smiling warmly. Emma laughed softly. "I didn't know anyone was still here." "I couldn't leave without listening," he said. "You know the cafe's been getting calls from people asking when you're performing again." Her eyes widened. "Really?" He nodded. "Some want to book you for weddings, others for small events. Looks like you're in demand, Miss Star." Emma shook her head, laughing. "I'm not a star." "Maybe not to you," he said, walking closer. "But to everyone who's seen you play, you are. You've given this place a soul." His words made her chest tighten with emotion. She looked at the piano and whispered, "I thought I lost this part of me forever." He smiled. "Sometimes, life just waits for the right moment to remind us who we are." She nodded, blinking away a tear. "Maybe you're right." That weekend, Emma agreed to play at a local charity event for children. It was held in a small community hall, simple but full of heart. As she began her performance, she noticed a young boy sitting near the stage, watching her with wide eyes. His hands moved slightly in the air, copying her finger movements. After the show, he approached her shyly. "I want to play like you," he said, "but we don't have a piano at home." Emma knelt down, smiling warmly. "You don't need one yet. All you need is love for music. When you have that, the rest will come." The boy grinned. "Can I come to your cafe sometime and listen?" "Of course," she said softly. "You're always welcome." As he ran off to join his parents, Emma stood still, watching him go. She realized that just as her mother's love for music had shaped her, maybe her story could inspire someone else. Maybe this was the true gift of what had happened, not just rediscovering her dream, but helping others find theirs too. Later that night, she returned to the cafe to close up. She sat at the piano one last time, playing a soft, slow tune. The melody felt lighter than ever, full of gratitude. The moonlight from the window cast a gentle glow across her face as she played, her eyes half closed in peace. When the last note faded, Emma let out a long breath. She wasn't the same woman who once hid behind trays and coffee cups, afraid to be seen. She was stronger now, braver. She had faced laughter, fear, and failure, and turned them into music. Outside, the street was quiet. A couple walked by, holding hands, smiling as they heard the faint melody drifting from the cafe. They didn't know the story behind it. They didn't know the girl who had fought her way back to her dream. But they paused for a moment to listen, because the music touched something in them too. Inside, Emma smiled to herself, resting her hands gently on the keys. "Thank you," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself. She turned off the lights, hung up her apron, and stepped outside into the night. The stars above glittered softly, and in their quiet glow, Emma felt something deep and certain. Her story wasn't ending. It was only beginning. Because sometimes the greatest performances don't happen on grand stages, but in the hearts of those who find their courage again. And as Emma walked home, humming softly to herself, she knew this truth for sure. Once you rediscover your song, the world will always stop to listen. The night of the charity concert became a turning point, not just for Emma, but for everyone who had witnessed her journey. The next morning, sunlight poured through the cafe windows like gold, and for once, Emma didn't feel the usual weight of routine. She moved with quiet confidence, humming as she arranged the tables and polished the counter. Her co-workers noticed it too. "You're glowing," one of them said with a grin. Emma laughed softly. "Maybe I'm just happy." It was true. Happiness had found its way back into her life. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the soft, steady one that lives quietly in your heart. The kind that comes from doing what you love, and finally believing you deserve it. Over the following weeks, the cafe became a little different. People no longer came just for the coffee. They came for the feeling. Emma's music had become the soul of the place. Sometimes she played during slow afternoons, filling the room with gentle melodies that made even strangers smile. Other times, she taught children simple tunes after hours, laughing as they pressed the wrong keys and tried again. Her story had spread far beyond the cafe now. Local news stations wanted interviews, and people sent her letters, some from other cities, some from other countries. Most of them wrote about how her courage had inspired them to follow their own forgotten dreams. One letter stood out to her. It came from a woman named Clara who wrote, "I used to sing when I was young, but I stopped because people laughed. Watching your story reminded me that the laughter doesn't matter. Only the love does. I started singing again. Thank you." Emma held the letter against her chest, tears forming in her eyes. That was when she realized something truly beautiful. Her story had stopped being about her. It had become something bigger, something that belonged to everyone who had ever been afraid to chase what set their soul on fire. One quiet evening, long after the last customer had left, Emma stayed behind once again. The cafe lights were dim, and the world outside glowed with the soft orange of street lamps. She sat at the piano, the same one that had started everything, and took a deep breath. She played softly, a slow, emotional piece she had been working on for weeks. It had no name yet, but it carried all her feelings: loss, hope, courage, and rebirth. Every note felt like a memory. The laughter that once stung, the fear that once silenced her, the applause that had set her free. Halfway through, she closed her eyes and whispered, "This one's for you, Mom." The music swelled gently, tender and alive. She could almost feel her mother's presence beside her, warm, loving, proud. The melody rose like sunlight breaking through clouds, then softened, fading into peaceful silence. When the last note died, Emma sat still for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around her. She smiled through her tears, her heart full. A soft clap came from behind her. The manager stood at the doorway, eyes shining. "What was that one called?" he asked. Emma turned toward him, her smile gentle. "I think I'll call it Home." He nodded slowly. "It's perfect." As she stood to leave, she looked around the cafe one last time. It wasn't just a workplace anymore. It was the place where she had fallen, stood back up, and rediscovered herself. The piano in the corner wasn't just an instrument. It was a witness to her transformation. Outside, the night was cool and calm. Emma walked home beneath the stars, her steps light and sure. The city lights twinkled like notes on a page, and in that moment, everything felt connected. Her past, her pain, her hope, and her music. When she reached the corner, she passed a street musician playing guitar. He smiled at her, nodding in rhythm. She paused, listened for a moment, then dropped a coin in his case and said, "Keep playing. Someone out there needs to hear it." He grinned, and she walked on, her heart warm. As she turned the final corner toward her apartment, she thought about how everything had begun. A quiet waitress, laughter from a crowd, an empty piano. How something so small had changed her life forever. It wasn't luck or fate, it was courage. The courage to take one step, one note, one chance. And as the night breeze brushed against her face, Emma whispered to herself, almost like a promise, never stop playing. Because life, she had learned, was a lot like music, sometimes soft, sometimes loud, sometimes full of mistakes. But when you play with heart, even the broken notes can turn into something beautiful. And from that night on, wherever Emma went, people didn't just remember her as the waitress who played the piano. They remembered her as the woman who taught the world that no dream is ever too late to chase, and no voice too quiet to be heard.